It became an unlikely inspiration, whispered not as disgrace, but as hope. Within the mansion, life found new rhythm. Lucas no longer looked at his father with disappointment, but with pride. Their evenings grew warmer, filled with conversations once buried beneath silence. Grant, awkward at first, learned to say the words he had always withheld. "I love you, son." Lucas clung to those words as if they were treasures, for to him, they were. Naomi remained, not as a shadow in the background, but as a presence respected openly. Grant no longer introduced her to visitors as the maid, but simply as Naomi. Some guests still raised brows, but others, quietly watching, began to question their own walls of prejudice. On a quiet evening months later, Grant stood in the kitchen doorway watching a familiar sight. Lucas perched on the counter, Naomi guiding his hands as they kneaded dough together, laughter spilling like music. The memory of that first night returned, but everything had changed. He was no longer a man shocked at what he saw. He was a man grateful. For the first time, Grant understood that wealth was not measured in balance sheets or stock prices, but in the bonds of love and dignity that no scandal could erase. His empire might rise or fall, but here, in the warmth of a kitchen, in the laughter of his son, in the courage of a woman who had faced prejudice with grace, he had found something greater than wealth. He had found redemption. In the days that followed, pressure mounted. Jonathan Sinclair called him twice, each time sharper than the last. "You must cut this off, Grant. Apologize, dismiss her, and salvage what you can. Do it now before the damage becomes permanent." His sister Victoria was relentless, filling his phone with messages about disgrace, about the family name, about how he was jeopardizing everything their parents had built. Through it all, Naomi remained dignified. She carried out her duties with quiet grace, never complaining, never faltering, though her eyes betrayed the weight she carried. Late one evening, after Lucas had gone to bed, she approached Grant in his study. Her hands were clasped tightly before her, but her voice was steady. "Mr. Ellison," she said softly, "perhaps it is time I left. I never meant to cause division in your life. Lucas will be hurt, but he will heal. Children are resilient. It would protect you. It would protect him from the cruelty of others." The words cut deeper than any headline. For a long moment, Grant said nothing, his breath heavy, his gaze locked on her. Finally, he rose, his voice breaking the silence with more conviction than she had ever heard from him. "No," he said, "you will not leave. I won't allow it." Naomi blinked, startled, but he stepped closer, his tone fierce. "For years I told myself that protecting my son meant shielding him with wealth, with walls, with rules. But I see now that protecting him means giving him truth, giving him love, giving him people who will stand by him no matter what the world says. You've given him that when I failed to, and I'll be damned if I let anyone take it away." His words hung in the air, charged with finality. Naomi lowered her eyes, overwhelmed, but when she lifted them again, her gaze shimmered with quiet strength. "Then you will face more storms," she whispered. "Then let them come," Grant replied. "I've weathered storms before. This time, at least, I'll be standing for something that matters." The true test came sooner than expected. At the next board meeting, his investors circled like vultures, demanding explanations. One after another, they spoke of image, of reputation, of the risk of scandal undermining their ventures. At last, Sinclair rose, his voice sharp as a blade. "Grant, this is your last chance. Dismiss her. End this nonsense. Otherwise, we walk. And when we walk, your empire falls." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to him, waiting, some eager, some sympathetic, but all expecting him to bend. Grant rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished table. His voice was calm, but each word landed with the weight of iron. "For years, you have trusted me because I never wavered, because I built this empire on discipline and control. But control without conscience is nothing. You ask me to dismiss the woman who has given my son joy, who has reminded me what it means to be a father, not just a provider. If keeping your favor means betraying them, then I will not pay that price. Walk if you must. My empire will survive, but even if it doesn't, my family will." The silence that followed was thunderous. Some investors shifted uncomfortably, others exchanged skeptical glances, but no one spoke. For the first time, the man they had seen only as a ruthless businessman revealed something they had not expected: humanity. And in that humanity lay a strength that no contract could measure. News of his defiance spread quickly, as gossip always does, but so too did another story. Rumors of scandal faded as accounts of his speech at the banquet and his stand in the boardroom began to circulate. Some called it reckless, others quietly called it courageous. And among the ordinary people, those beyond the glittering walls of privilege, the story took on a life of its own. They saw not scandal, but a wealthy man humbled by love, standing against prejudice for the sake of his child. Grant's pulse roared in his ears. He looked at Lucas, his small fists clenched in determination, and then at Naomi, who stood poised with dignity, refusing to shrink even as judgment rained upon her. Something inside him broke. For years he had built an empire on the perception of strength, had measured success in contracts and headlines. But at this table, under his own roof, he realized the only true strength was standing by what mattered, even when the world sneered. He rose from his seat, the scrape of his chair against the marble echoing like thunder. The room fell silent again, every guest holding their breath. His voice, when it came, was calm but charged with a conviction none had heard from him in years. "My son," he said slowly, "has spoken with more truth than any of us at this table tonight. He sees what most of us have forgotten, that worth is not determined by titles or wealth, but by the heart we carry. Naomi Carter has given him what money cannot buy: trust, laughter, and presence. If any of you find that scandalous, then perhaps the scandal lies not in her presence, but in your blindness." The words cracked through the air like a whip. Some shifted uncomfortably, others scowled, but none dared challenge him outright. Victoria's eyes narrowed, fury simmering at the public defiance, but even she knew this was not the moment to strike. Grant turned to Lucas and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "You were brave tonight, son. Braver than most men I know." Then with deliberate care, he extended his gaze to Naomi, whose composure had not wavered. "And as long as you remain in this house, you will have my respect, not just as staff, but as someone who has reminded us all of what truly matters." For a moment, time seemed to still. Naomi inclined her head, her voice low but steady. "Thank you, Mr. Ellison." The evening stumbled forward after that, the air thick with unspoken judgments, but the damage to appearances had been done. Rumors would spread faster now, painted with scandal, but something deeper had shifted in the mansion. Lucas had drawn the line. Grant had chosen to stand beside him. And Naomi, though silent, had proven that dignity needs no defense when truth is on its side. That night, long after the last guest departed and the last glass was cleared, Grant stood in the darkened garden staring at the stars. He knew the battle was far from over. His allies would question him, his rivals would exploit the whispers, even his sister would not relent. But in the echo of his son's voice and the quiet strength of Naomi's gaze, he felt a clarity he had not known in years. The world beyond the gates might see scandal, but within his home he had glimpsed something greater: the possibility of redemption. And though the storm had broken, Grant Ellison understood one truth with absolute certainty: he would never again let his son fight alone. Redemption. The banquet had ended, but its echoes traveled far beyond the marble walls of the Ellison mansion. Within 24 hours, newspapers ran veiled stories of a scandal brewing in high society. Anonymous whispers became printed lines, hinting at impropriety, at blurred roles, at a household where the son of a millionaire found companionship in a servant. Rivals smirked behind polished smiles, allies pressed for explanations, and investors began to question whether the Ellison empire was as untouchable as it had once seemed. Grant read the headlines in silence, his expression stoic, but inside the storm raged. For years he had built his fortune on control, on the ability to anticipate threats and neutralize them before they struck. But this was not a threat of numbers or contracts. This was a threat to image, to reputation, to the carefully cultivated armor that had defined his life. And for the first time he found himself questioning whether that armor was worth protecting at all. The breaking point: the Ellison mansion had seen many gatherings, from glittering galas to intimate dinners where every word carried the weight of strategy. But tonight's charity banquet was different. For years, Grant had hosted an annual fundraiser for the city's hospital wing, an event where every seat at his dining table was filled with faces of influence, senators, financiers, heads of corporations. To decline attendance was to decline power. This year, however, the event carried attention that even the chandeliers could not disguise. The whispers that had circled quietly in boardrooms and drawing rooms were now waiting to surface in the very heart of his home. Grant had ordered the evening as perfectly as ever. The crystal gleamed, the china was flawless, the wine was vintage. Yet beneath the glitter, he felt unease coil in his stomach like smoke. Naomi and the staff moved gracefully through the hall, serving trays with quiet dignity, ensuring no glass remained empty and no guest unattended. Lucas, dressed in a miniature suit, sat beside his father at the long table, wide-eyed at the spectacle but clutching the comfort of his teddy bear beneath the tablecloth. It was supposed to be seamless, but seamlessness is fragile and fragility shatters with the slightest pressure. The pressure came when Senator Aldridge, a man whose reputation carried more arrogance than accomplishment, leaned across his plate and said loudly enough for the table to hear, "Grant, your boy seems rather taken with that maid of yours. I noticed how his eyes follow her. Quite unusual, don't you think? Some might call it inappropriate." The room stilled. Forks paused mid-air. A few polite coughs attempted to mask the tension, but the words had landed like a stone in water rippling outward. Lucas's cheeks flushed, his small hands tightening around his napkin. Grant's jaw hardened. "Lucas is a child," he said evenly, though the steel in his tone was unmistakable. "He trusts those who treat him with kindness. That is all." But Aldridge was a man who thrived on cruelty. He smirked, swirling his wine lazily. Kindness, yes, but kindness from the wrong quarters breeds confusion. A boy of his standing ought to learn boundaries early, lest he mistake friendship for something else. It reflects, you see, on the family's judgment. The words were deliberate, barbed with prejudice. Grant's fingers curled against the table, fury simmering just beneath the surface. But before he could speak, a small voice broke the silence. Lucas stood from his chair, his small body trembling, yet his voice carrying a clarity that silenced the room. "She is not just a maid," he declared, his eyes flashing with defiance. "She is my friend. She listens when no one else does. She makes me laugh. She makes me feel like I matter. And if any of you think that's wrong, then you don't understand me at all." The gasp that swept through the room was sharp, scandalized, as though the boy had upended centuries of unwritten rules with a single speech. Faces turned, expressions shifting from shock to disdain to thinly veiled amusement. But none dared laugh openly, for the fire in Lucas's eyes was too fierce. Naomi, standing at the far end of the room with a tray in her hands, felt her breath catch. She had not asked for this defense, had never sought the spotlight, but hearing the child speak such raw truth tore at her heart. She lowered her eyes, willing herself to remain composed even as every guest's gaze shifted toward her. Victoria Ellison, seated midway down the table, seized the moment. Her voice cut through the stunned silence. "This is exactly what I warned you about, Grant. Attachments like this blur lines, confuse roles, and invite disgrace. Look at the spectacle your son is Krars. Eded, defending staff as though they were equals. I know. Imagine what people will say if it continues. It reflects poorly on Grant. One must be careful with appearances." Lucas froze, his small fists clenching at his sides. Heat burned his cheeks, not fully understanding the layers of prejudice in their words, but knowing enough to feel the sting. He ran inside, tears brimming in his eyes, and found Naomi in the library stacking books. She knelt immediately when she saw him, her voice soft. "Lucas, what's wrong?" They said you shouldn't be my friend," he choked out, his voice breaking. "They said it makes Daddy look bad." Naomi's heart tightened, but she pulled him into her arms, smoothing his hair gently. "Listen to me, Lucas. People often fear what they don't understand. They hide their fear behind cruel words. But you and we know the truth of our friendship. No one can take that from us unless we let them." "But what if Daddy believes them?" Lucas whispered, his eyes searching hers with desperation. Naomi hesitated, her throat tightening before answering with quiet strength. Then it will be his battle to fight, not yours. You have already been brave by loving openly. That is never wrong. Unbeknownst to them, Grant stood at the doorway, hidden in shadow, having arrived home earlier than expected. He heard every word, saw the way his son clung to Naomi, and for the second time in as many weeks he felt the sting of shame cut deeper than pride. His own world had reduced a woman of courage and dignity to whispers of impropriety, and worse, his son was paying the price. The breaking point came days later during a private meeting with one of his most powerful business allies, Jonathan Sinclair. A man of old money and sharper instincts, Sinclair was blunt where others were sly. He wasted no time over cigars and brandy, leaning forward with narrowed eyes. Grant, I'll speak plainly. Rumors are spread. Ding! Your boy's attachment to the Maid is raising eyebrows. Investors are whispering about distraction, about weakness. You cannot afford this. Distance must be enforced. Grant's jaw tightened. My household is my concern, Jonathan. Your household is your image, Sinclair shot back, and your image is currency. Tarnish it and you bleed leverage. Be wise, Grant. Let her go. Hire someone else discreetly. The boy will adjust. They always do. For a long moment, silence stretched between them. Grant's mind raced. In Sinclair's world, appearances outweighed truth and weakness invited ruin. But in his heart, another truth warred violently. Naomi had given Lucas what no contract or fortune could: laughter, confidence, life. Could he truly erase that for the sake of whispers? When Sinclair left, Grant remained seated long after, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair, his thoughts a battlefield. For the first time, the man who had never bowed to pressure in the boardroom found himself cornered not by numbers, but by the fragile smile of his son. That night, Grant entered the kitchen where Naomi was quietly tidying after dinner. The house was hushed, Lucas already asleep upstairs. He stood there watching her move with calm efficiency, until finally he spoke, his voice heavier than she had ever heard. Naomi, the world outside these walls doesn't see what I see. They twist what is pure into scandal. Today, I was told to dismiss you for the sake of my reputation. She froze, then turned slowly to face him, her eyes steady though her breath caught faintly. And will you? Grant's answer came with the weight of a man caught between two truths. I don't know. The words hung between them, fragile, unfinished, but in that moment both understood that the days ahead would demand more than quiet courage. They would demand sacrifice, conviction, and a choice that success would change everything. Yet doubt gnawed at him. What if Victoria was right? What if society, his business associates, his rivals, what if they saw his leniency as weakness? He had built his empire on strength, on control, on commanding respect. Could he afford to risk even the perception of impropriety? As he wrestled with these questions, he heard a faint knock at the door. It was Naomi. She stood in the doorway, her posture humble but her expression calm. I didn't mean to cause trouble, she said softly. Grant studied her for a long moment. You didn't. She caused her own. Naomi hesitated, then stepped forward. I know I don't belong to your world, Mr. Ellison, but I do belong to Lucas's, not because of my title, but because I care. If you ever decide I should go, I will go quietly, but know this, your son will not forget what it felt like to be seen. Her words struck him like a knife and a bomb at once. He nodded slowly, unable to summon the walls that once shielded him. And as Naomi left the room, the truth pressed heavier on his chest. The storm had only begun, and the battle would not be fought in boardrooms, but in the chambers of his own heart. Whispers in the halls. The Ellison name had always carried weight in the city's elite circles. For decades, business leaders and politicians had uttered it with a mixture of respect and envy. To be an Ellison meant to embody control, wealth, and the careful preservation of an image polished until it gleamed. That image had served Grant well, shielding him through countless negotiations and rivalries. But images are fragile things, and whispers travel faster than truth. It began innocuously. A dinner party hosted by one of Grant's partners, an evening filled with the clink of crystal glasses and the low murmur of calculated conversations. Grant attended with his usual poise, every inch the millionaire executive, though his thoughts languid, read at home where Lucas would be finishing piano practice under Naomi's gentle encouragement. The evening was uneventful until a silver-haired investor leaned across the table and spoke with the kind of feigned casualness that drips with intention. "Grant, I hear your boy has taken to the new Maid. Quite attached, they say. A curious arrangement, isn't it? People are talking." The words froze him mid-sip. He forced a polite smile, but the investor's eyes glittered with knowing malice. Around the table, subtle smirks flickered, as though the scent of scandal had been caught in the air. No one spoke openly, but the silence was heavier than accusations. Grant swallowed his retort and redirected the conversation, but inside, fury twisted like a blade. How quickly society sharpened its knives when given even the faintest excuse. In their world, a maid was to remain invisible, background noise to the glittering stage of wealth. Naomi's quiet courage, her bond with Lucas, these were not celebrated but scrutinized, distorted into impropriety by those too blind to see dignity where they expected servitude. When he returned home that night, his steps echoed with uncharacteristic heaviness. The mansion loomed around him, its walls whispering with secrets. He found Lucas asleep, his small hand clutching a crumpled sketch of a piano, Naomi's handwriting at the bottom encouraging him. "Every note you play is yours. Don't be afraid of mistakes." The sight pierced Grant's heart, but it also hardened his resolve. His son's joy was real. The whispers outside were poison, yet he knew poison had a way of seeping through even the strongest walls. The following week, the poison reached Lucas himself. He had been playing in the garden, chasing the autumn leaves that swirled in the breeze, when he overheard two visiting guests, wives of Grant's associates, speaking near the terrace, their voice as carried in that careless way of the privileged, sharp words flung without thought for who might be listening. "It's shameful, really. A child of his standing spending all his time with her." Lucas perched happily at the counter, flour dusting his sleeves, while Naomi guided his small hands as he pressed cookie cutters into dough. They were so engrossed that they didn't notice the new arrival until Victoria's voice sliced through the air like glass. "And who," she demanded, "is this?" Lucas looked up, startled, while Naomi straightened instinctively, wiping her hands on a towel before inclining her head politely. "Good afternoon, ma'am. I'm Naomi Carter." "Carter?" Victoria repeated, her tone laced with skepticism. She turned sharply to her brother. "Grant, do you mean to tell me that this is the new maid you've hired?" "Yes," Grant replied evenly. "She came recommended." Victoria's laugh was sharp, hollow. "Recommended for domestic work, certainly. But what is she doing here, entertaining your son like a governess, as though she were family? I don't recall the Ellisons needing hired companions." The words hung heavy, dripping with disdain. Lucas shifted uncomfortably, his young face clouding with confusion. Naomi remained calm, her gaze steady, though the tension in her posture betrayed the sting. She replied softly, "I was keeping him company. He enjoys baking." Victoria's eyes narrowed. "That may be, but there are boundaries in households like this. Lines that ought not to be crossed. Lucas should understand his place as an Ellison, and you should understand yours as staff." Before Naomi could respond, Lucas's voice broke through, trembling yet determined. "She is my friend, Aunt Victoria, not just staff. She listens to me." The room went still. The defiance in the boy's tone stunned even Grant, who had rarely seen his son push back against an adult with such conviction. Victoria's face hardened, her lips pursed in disapproval. "Friend?" she repeated, as though the word were poisonous. "Grant, surely you see what this is. You are allowing bound areas to blur. A child should not be so attached. It is improper, dangerous even. What will people say?" Grant inhaled deeply, every instinct of his upbringing urging him to agree, to maintain appearances, to keep the order his family name demanded. Yet as his gaze shifted to Lucas, he saw the boy's small frame bristling with protectiveness, his eyes shining with the kind of loyalty no tutor or nanny had ever earned. And then his gaze moved to Naomi, who stood silent, neither defensive nor submissive, her dignity intact even under insult. The conflict churned inside him. He was a man raised to believe in power, in hierarchy, in carefully constructed roles, but he was also a father, and for the first time in years, he saw his son alive with conviction. "Enough," Grant said quietly, though the weight in his tone silenced even Victoria. "Naomi has done nothing wrong. Lucas is happy, and that matters more than appearances." Victoria's brows shot upward, disbelief flickering across her face. "You cannot be serious. Are you truly allowing this experiment to continue? Do you realize how it looks?" "I realize," Grant said firmly, though his heart thundered. "And I also realize my son's happiness cannot be measured by how it looks." The clash of siblings hung unresolved, Victoria's eyes narrowing as though she saw a weakness she had never expected in her brother. Without another word, she turned on her heel and swept out of her heels striking the floor with sharp finality. That night, after the storm of her visit, Grant stood alone in his study, staring out at the darkened garden. His mind replayed the confrontation, every word echoing against the fragile truths Naomi had already forced him to confront. He had stood by her, not out of defiance toward his sister, but because in that moment he could not deny the evidence before his eyes. Lucas was happy. Lucas has trusted her, and he could not bring himself to destroy that, even if the world beyond his gates disapproved. He could not decide whether to resent Naomi or to silently thank her. One evening, while standing outside his office, he overheard Lucas ask her a question that made his heart stop. "Naomi, do you think Daddy loves me? He never says it out loud." Naomi was quiet for a long moment before she answered with the gentleness of someone handling fragile glass. "Your father loves you more than you know, Lucas. Some people just struggle to show it. Love can get buried under grief, under work, under fear, but it's there. I see it, even if he doesn't say it enough." Grant closed his eyes, every word striking like a hammer against the armor he had built around his heart. He realized with sudden clarity that Naomi was not simply caring for his son. She was protecting the bond between them, even when he himself had neglected it. And that realization left him shaken. In the privacy of his own room that night, Grant poured himself another drink and stared at his reflection in the mirror. He saw a man draped in wealth, yet starved of connection, a man who had measured success by the weight of contracts instead of the strength of his son's laughter. The mirror reflected the truth he had long avoided. He had become the ghost of his own home. And now, a woman he barely knew was breathing life back into the place, reminding him of what it meant to be more than a provider. He placed the glass down, unfinished, and whispered to the empty room, "What am I doing?" But the silence gave him no answer, only the faint echo of Naomi's words. Sometimes it's not about place, it's about heart. And in that silence, he realized for the first time that his empire of marble and steel might crumble if he could not learn to reclaim his heart before it was too late. The storm from outside. The Ellison mansion had always been a fortress of prestige, a place where appearances were guarded as carefully as the treasures inside its vault-like walls. For years, Grant had ensured that nothing within those gates gave outsiders reason to doubt his control. Yet in recent weeks, subtle ripples had shifted the air, and for the first time warmth seemed to outweigh rigidity. Lucas's laughter had returned to the corridors, staff members exchanged more natural smiles, and a rhythm of life pulsed through the once hollow halls. To anyone within, the change was unmistakable, but to those beyond the gates, it remained invisible, at least until the day his sister arrived. Victoria Ellison was everything her brother was not. Where Grant cloaked himself in silence and order, Victoria wielded her influence with flamboyance. Her arrival was never quiet. The purr of a luxury car down the driveway, the staccato click of heels across marble, the sweep of silk scarves and jewels announcing her presence before her voice ever did. She swept into the foyer like a storm in designer heels, arms laden with gifts for her nephew, her sharp eyes already assessing every detail around her. "Grant," she said, kissing his cheek perfunctorily, though her perfume lingered longer than the gesture itself. "I thought I'd surprise you, but it seems you're not the only one with surprises in this house." Grant raised a brow. "What do you mean?" Her smile was thin, her eyes cutting toward the kitchen where faint laughter drifted. I've heard a child's voice, and a woman's, and unless you've remarried without informing me, I'd like to know who occupies your kitchen so freely. Grant's chest tightened. He knew exactly what she had heard. Lucas and Naomi were likely baking again, their laughter spilling without restraint. For a moment he considered deflecting, but Victoria was not the kind of woman easily dissuaded. With a resigned exhale, he gestured for her to follow. When they entered the kitchen, the scene mirrored the first night Grant had returned unexpectedly. Lucas was curled beneath the covers, wide-eyed but content, while Naomi sat on the edge of the bed, speaking gently about a story from her childhood. She spoke not with grandeur, but with truth. She told Lucas about growing up in a small neighborhood where money was scarce but love was not, where neighbors looked out for one another, and where the simplest joys, a game in the street, a song hummed by her grandmother, were treasures greater than gold. Lucas listened intently, his breathing slowing as her words wrapped around him like a blanket. Grant leaned against the doorframe, unseen, and something about her voice pulled him back to a time before his wealth had defined him, before his name had been spoken in boardrooms, back when life had been simpler, more human. He had almost forgotten that man. Almost. The following morning, Grant summoned Naomi to his study. She entered with quiet composure, hands folded neatly before her, and waited as he closed the door behind her. The room was lined with shelves of leather-bound books and awards, symbols of his success, yet for the first time he felt they were flimsy shields in her presence. He gestured toward the chair across from his desk. Sit. She obeyed, her posture upright, her eyes steady. Grant studied her for a long moment as though trying to solve a puzzle. Finally, he spoke. My son has grown attached to you. His voice was even, but beneath it lay currents of suspicion and curiosity. Why do you think that is? Naomi did not hesitate. Because I listen. Because I see him. Grant's brow furrowed. Others have listened. He's had tutors, nannies. They followed instructions. She interrupted softly, though respectfully. They told him when to eat, when to study, when to sleep. But they didn't hear him. Children know the difference, Mr. Ellison. He knows the difference. Her words lingered in the air like smoke. Grant clenched his jaw, unsettled by the precision of her truth. For years he had dismissed his son's restlessness as childish whim, something to be disciplined or redirected. But Naomi had looked past the surface and seen what he had missed. A boy starved not of privilege, but of presence. Why are you really here? He asked suddenly, his tone sharper. Most people don't take work like this if they have better options. Naomi's gaze dropped briefly, her hands tightening in her lap, before she lifted her eyes again. Because I need the work. Because my younger brother is in college, and I promised I'd help him through. Because my mother is ill, and her medicine isn't cheap, and because... She hesitated, her voice softening. Because I believe dignity is found in how we do even the smallest things. Whether I am serving in a mansion or sweeping a classroom, my worth is in the care I give. Grant was silent. He had expected excuses or apologies, not conviction. For the first time in years, he felt the sharp edge of humility cutting into his pride. He dismissed her with a quiet nod, but long after she left the room, her words remained etched in his mind. As days turned into weeks, the mansion itself seemed to mirror the changes rippling through its inhabitants. The staff, once rigid and fearful, now moved with subtle ease. They no longer whispered with the same tension in their voices. Naomi's quiet courage had begun to bleed into them as well. She never sought to command, yet people gravitated toward her steadiness. Even Mr. Lawson, the estate manager, found himself softened in her presence, though he would never admit it openly. Lucas thrived most of all. His piano lessons grew brighter, his drawings more vivid, his laughter freer. He followed Naomi with the unguarded devotion of a child who had finally found an anchor. Grant watched this with conflicted eyes. Each moment of joy his son shared with her was a reminder of what he himself had failed to give, yet also a strange relief that someone was providing it. The mansion had never felt more alive than in the weeks that followed. Lucas bloomed under Naomi's care, and even the other staff seemed drawn to her quiet confidence. She carried herself with dignity, never overstepping her duties yet, never hesitating to offer kindness where it was needed. Grant watched all of this from the shadows of his routines, telling himself that her influence would fade, but instead, it only deepened, weaving itself into the fabric of the household. For the first time in years, there was warmth in the air, laughter in the halls, and a child's smile echoing against the marble walls. And yet, beneath that warmth, Grant felt something stirring that unsettled him. A mixture of guilt, envy, and perhaps something he could not yet name. What Naomi did not know was that her presence was awakening wounds he had buried, and what Grant did not realize was that her strength would soon challenge not only his authority, but the very way he defined family. The shadows of the past were creeping into the present, and neither of them knew just how much their lives were about to change. Cracks in the armor. The days that followed unfolded like a quiet storm beneath the marble walls of the Ellison estate. Outwardly, everything appeared ordered, meals served on time, floors polished until they gleamed, staff members whispering respectfully in the hallways. But under that surface, a current was shifting, subtle yet powerful. Grant felt it in the way his son smiled more easily, in the sudden bursts of laughter echoing from rooms that had long stood silent, in the new warmth that dared to creep into corners once frozen by grief. And at the center of this transformation stood Naomi Carter, whose presence was no longer an anonymous addition to the staff, but a force reshaping the household itself. Grant tried to ignore it at first. He buried himself in contracts, in meetings, eatings that stretched late into the evening, in numbers that comforted him with their precision. He convinced himself that her influence was temporary, a passing distraction that would dissolve when the novelty wore off. Yet each evening when he returned from his office and walked through the halls, he found Lucas curled up near Naomi, either with a book in his lap or a smile tugging at his lips. Sometimes the boy would sit at the piano and attempt a clumsy tune, Naomi patiently listening and applauding every effort. Other times he would chatter endlessly about his day, his small hands waving animatedly, his eyes sparkling in a way Grant had not seen in years. It gnawed at him. Not because Lucas was happy, that should have been a father's joy, but because he realized he had failed to be the source of that happiness. He had been replaced, though Naomi had never once attempted to usurp him. It was Lucas himself who had chosen where to pour his trust. That knowledge unsettled Grant in ways no business rival ever had. One evening after dinner, Grant remained at the long dining table long after the plates had been cleared. He sat in the dim glow of the chandelier, staring at the reflection of his own hands against the polished wood. He thought about his wife, about the promise he had made to her in the hospital that he would protect Lucas, that he would give their son the best life possible. In his mind, best had meant financial security, private tutors, elite opportunities. But what if best had been simpler? What if it had only meant presence, warmth, laughter shared at midnight over a plate of cookies? He swallowed hard, an unfamiliar weight pressing against his chest. It was not the pressure of a corporate decision. It was the ache of regret. Later that night, as he passed Lucas's bedroom door, he heard voices, soft, almost like a lullaby. Curiosity pulled him closer, until he was standing at the edge of the doorway. Inside, the next morning, the mansion returned to its polished rhythm. Staff moved through the halls quietly, carrying trays and polishing furniture. Yet beneath the surface, the air seemed charged, as though everyone had sensed the unusual clash the night before. Grant appeared at the breakfast table in his usual tailored suit, his expression unreadable as he scanned the reports on his tablet. Lucas sat across from him, unusually quiet, pushing scrambled eggs around his plate. The silence between father and son grew heavier with each passing minute, until Naomi entered with a tray of freshly baked rolls. Her presence filled the room, though she moved with humility and professionalism. She greeted both with a polite, "Good morning," before setting the tray down. Lucas immediately brightened and offered her a smile, which she returned warmly. The exchange did not escape Grant's notice. He lowered his tablet and studied the way his son's shoulders eased whenever Naomi was near. It was not obedience that Lucas showed her, but trust, something Grant himself had not been able to earn so easily. After breakfast, Grant summoned his estate manager, Mr. Lawson, a thin man with a sharp jaw and the habit of wringing his hands when nervous. Who hired her? Grant asked curtly, not bothering with preamble. Naomi Carter, sir, Lawson replied quickly. She came highly recommended from the agency. Excellent references, no complaints from previous employers. I thought she would be a suitable replacement after Mrs. Whitmore resigned. Grant leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. And you saw nothing unusual in her manner? Lawson hesitated. She is different from the others, sir. More outspoken. But the boy took to her immediately, and she has proven capable. Frankly, the household has been calmer since her arrival. The words grated against Grant's pride, but he dismissed Lawson with a wave. Alone once again, he allowed himself to wonder, why does this woman unsettle me so much? Naomi, meanwhile, spent the morning in the laundry room folding clothes with her usual care. Yet her thoughts were elsewhere. She had seen the cold distance in Mr. Ellison's eyes, the way he carried himself like a fortress that no one dared approach. She knew men like him, powerful, wealthy, but often the loneliest of all. She had not meant to challenge him, not deliberately, but she had grown up learning that silence in the face of need was another form of cruelty. Her younger siblings had relied on her when their own parents faltered. She had been only 12 when she learned how to cook, how to clean, how to soothe tears that weren't hers. Responsibility had been stitched into her life long before she arrived in this mansion. Caring for Lucas wasn't just a duty, it was instinct. That evening, as Lucas sat at the piano practicing scales half-heartedly, Naomi knelt beside him and asked gently, "What do you really want to play?" His eyes lit up, and instead of the rigid exercises assigned by his tutor, he began to stumble through a melody he had been humming quietly for days. His fingers were clumsy, but Naomi encouraged him, clapping softly when he found the right notes. What she didn't realize was that Grant had paused outside the door, watching unseen. His son's laughter spilled into the hallway once again, and this time Grant did not interrupt. He stood there for several minutes, torn between jealousy and awe. Jealous that his boy gave his joy so freely to someone else, but awed that such joy still existed within him at all. That night, as Grant lay awake staring at the ceiling of his master suite, he realized that the question was no longer, "What is she doing here?" but "What have I failed to do?" It was a question that would not let him sleep. He stood there staring at Naomi Carter as she quietly cleaned the flour off the counter, her movements graceful, deliberate, and unshaken. And for the first time in years, Grant Ellison wondered if maybe, just maybe, he wasn't the one holding this house together. Maybe it was her, Haddos of the past. The silence that followed Lucas's retreat to his bedroom seemed to stretch across the entire mansion. The faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway was the only sound that dared intrude upon the tension still hanging thick in the kitchen. Grant stood rooted in place, his eyes fixed on Naomi as she moved about the counters, cleaning with steady, deliberate strokes. Her calmness irritated him, not because she was disobedient, but because she refused to cower before him. He was accustomed to staff who bowed, who kept their voices low, who scrambled to avoid even the suggestion of displeasing their employer. Yet this young woman seemed carved from a different material altogether. She did not flinch beneath his authority. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had lived through storms far greater than his anger. Grant finally pulled himself away from the counter, loosening his tie as though it were choking him. He moved into the living room, poured himself a drink, and sank heavily into the leather armchair that overlooked the sprawling garden outside. The moonlight cut pale streaks across the manicured hedges, but his eyes weren't on the view. His mind returned again and again to what Naomi had said. Sometimes it's not about place, it's about heart. He heard the words replay in his head with the clarity of a bell, and though he tried to dismiss them as insolent, something deeper inside him resisted. She had spoken with conviction, not arrogance. She had spoken truths he had ignored for years. It was true. Lucas had been lonely. His son was growing up in a mansion filled with staff yet starved of warmth. Tutors instructed him, nannies supervised him, chefs prepared his meals, but none of them filled the hole left by his mother's absence. And Grant, buried beneath contracts, meetings, and boardrooms, had convinced himself that financial security would substitute for love. Tonight, however, the sight of Lucas laughing freely with Naomi had shaken that belief more than he cared to admit. As he sat there swirling the amber liquid in his glass, memories of his late wife flickered through his mind. She had been the anchor of the household, the gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder, the voice that reminded Grant that money was not the same as presence. But she had been gone for nearly 4 years, taken far too young, and Grant had responded to his grief by building walls around himself, walls of work and wealth. Perhaps he had convinced himself that those walls also protected his son. Yet when Lucas looked at him now, the boy's eyes carried a quiet disappointment that words could not hide. Naomi's presence had ripped a seam through those walls. That unsettled him more than he cared to show. Upstairs, Lucas clutched his teddy bear and stared at the ceiling. He could still hear the echo of his father's firm voice, could still feel the tension in the room when Daddy and Naomi had stood facing each other. It wasn't often that Lucas felt caught in the middle, but tonight had left his stomach twisting. He adored his father, even if he saw him so rarely, but Naomi had quickly become more than a maid to him. She listened in ways no one else did. She asked him about his dreams, about the drawings he kept tucked under his bed, about his fears of thunder at night. And most importantly, she never dismissed his feelings as silly. For a boy who had grown used to the silence of empty hallways, her presence felt like sunlight, breaking through endless gray clouds. He whispered to himself before sleep finally pulled him under. "Please don't let Daddy send her away." Lucas clung to his father's arm, tugging lightly. "I asked her, Daddy. I couldn't sleep, and she said warm cookies help. She was right. I feel better." The boy's innocence softened the moment, but Grant's eyes never left the maid. "I don't recall authorizing midnight kitchen lessons," he said sharply. The woman met his words with a calm nod. "No, sir, you didn't." But Lucas was restless, and sometimes children need comfort more than rules. Her tone wasn't defiant, but neither was it submissive. It was matter-of-fact. That startled him almost more than finding them here together. Most employees in this house avoided his eyes, nodded quickly, and followed orders without question. But this woman stood with quiet strength, her presence steady in the face of his authority. Lucas squeezed his hand. "Daddy, don't be mad. Naomi is nice. She listens." Grant's gaze snapped to his son. "Naomi?" "Yes," the boy said with pride. "Naomi Carter. She's new, but she's my friend." The millionaire's pulse quickened. He had approved a new maid through his estate manager before leaving for Europe, but he hadn't cared enough to memorize her name. And now, his son was calling her a friend. Friend. The word tasted strange. Old wounds. Grant's instinct screamed for control. He wanted to set boundaries, remind both his son and this woman of their places. The house had rules, and rules were the only thing that kept order. But as he looked at Lucas, his small face glowing with happiness, cheeks still powdered with flour, something inside him hesitated. He hadn't seen that smile in years. Not since. He pushed the thought away. Naomi wiped her hands on her apron. Her voice was soft but steady. "Mr. Ellison, if I've overstepped, I'll take responsibility." But Lucas was lonely. He needed someone to talk to. I couldn't just send him back to bed. Grant's eyes narrowed. "And you believe it's your place to decide what my son needs?" Her gaze didn't waver. "Sometimes it's not about place, it's about heart." The words struck him unexpectedly. For a long moment, silence filled the kitchen. Only the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock on the wall could be heard. Lucas looked between them nervously. "Daddy?" Grant exhaled slowly. He forced a smile for his son. "Go on upstairs, Lucas. I'll tuck you in soon." The boy hesitated. "But now." The firm tone left no room for argument. Lucas lowered his head, muttered, "Yes, Daddy," and trudged upstairs. His small footsteps faded into the silence. Grant and Naomi were left alone. The confrontation. Grant moved closer, his voice low but sharp. "I don't know who you think you are, Miss Carter, but you work for me. You're here to follow instructions, not to play mother." Naomi straightened her shoulders. I wasn't trying to replace anyone. I was just being there for a child who needed someone. The word someone landed heavily. It carried an unspoken truth. Lucas had been needing someone long before tonight. Grant's jaw clenched. He prided himself on control, on reputation, on never letting cracks show in his perfect image. But in front of this woman, this maid, he felt exposed. "Watch your tone," he warned. Naomi didn't flinch. "With respect, sir, I can't apologize for caring about your son. He deserves attention. He deserves love." Her words cut deeper than he expected. For a moment, he had no reply. And that silence, heavy and raw, filled the kitchen more than any argument could. The seed of change. Grant Ellison didn't know it then, but this night would mark the beginning of something far greater than a simple confrontation between employer and maid. This was the first fracture in the walls he had built around himself. The millionaire had returned home expecting control, expecting routine. Instead, he found a boy who smiled only when he was with the maid, and a maid who was unafraid to tell him truths no one else dared speak. The unexpected return. The door creaked open before Grant Ellison even stepped inside. His polished shoes touched the tiles of the private foyer, and the wheels of his sleek black suitcase rattled softly behind him. He looked every bit the man who had just flown across Europe sealing million-dollar deals. Tailored white suit, violet dress shirt, a platinum watch glinting under the ceiling light. But nothing about him looked prepared for what he was about to see. He wasn't supposed to be home until Friday. It was Tuesday night. A quiet smile tugged at his lips as he reached down and touched the small teddy bear tied to the suitcase handle, Lucas's favorite. He hadn't seen his son in 4 weeks. This was supposed to be a surprise visit, a father making up for lost time. Grant pushed the suitcase into the hallway, loosened his tie, and inhaled the familiar scent of cedarwood polish that always filled the mansion. He expected silence. At this hour, Lucas would normally be asleep, the staff would have finished their shifts, and the house would feel like a museum. But instead, there were sounds. From the direction of the kitchen, faint laughter drifted through the halls. It wasn't the polished, professional laugh of staff members trying to impress their employer. No, it was free, unrestrained, warm. Grant paused, his brows furrowed. He followed the sound quietly, his footsteps echoing against the marble floor. The nearer he came, the clearer the voices became. A child's soft giggle mixed with the gentle rhythm of a woman's voice. He turned the corner and froze. The scene was simple, but it hit him harder than any boardroom negotiation ever had. There, in the heart of his grand kitchen, his only son Lucas sat on the marble counter, swinging his small legs back and forth. A half-finished peanut butter sandwich sat beside him. Flour dusted the boy's pajama sleeves. His bright eyes were fixed on the woman standing next to him, and the boy's laughter rang like a bell each time she teased him. The woman was new, young, probably mid-20s, skin deep and rich as polished mahogany. She wore the crisp black and white uniform of the house staff, but something about her presence didn't fit the quiet, obedient mold Grant had always expected from employees. Her back was straight, her movements confident, her smile genuine. She didn't seem like she was working, she seemed at home. She was stirring cookie dough in a large glass bowl, and Lucas was holding the spoon as though he were her assistant. The two of them looked like they had been sharing this routine for weeks, maybe months, completely comfortable with one another. For a moment, Grant didn't speak. He didn't move. The boy who had refused to eat dinner without throwing tantrums, who sat in silence at the family table, who rarely looked his father in the eye. That same boy was now alive with joy, looking at this woman with trust. Something sharp tightened in Grant's chest. He cleared his throat. The sound broke the moment. Lucas's head snapped around, his little hands clutching the spoon mid-stir. His eyes widened in surprise. "Daddy?" The woman turned slowly, and for a second her smile faltered when she saw the man in the doorway. She didn't bow her head like most staff did. She didn't rush to explain herself. Instead, she held his gaze calmly, as though she had nothing to hide. Grant stepped inside. His voice was cool. "What is going on here?" A house divided, Lucas scrambled off the counter and rushed toward him. "Daddy, you're home early." His voice was filled with delight, but Grant's attention was fixed firmly on the woman. Her hands were steady as she set the bowl down. "Good evening, Mr. Ellison," she said politely, her voice smooth. "I was just helping Lucas Maurus. Ate cookies, he couldn't sleep." Grant's jaw tightened. "Cookies? At this hour?"